This is a short video about the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, along with the brain. And the spinal cord, at its basic level, really isn't all that complicated. It's got some simple anatomy to it, and in terms of its physiology, it really only does a couple things. So the spinal cord lies within the spinal cavity, which is in our dorsal body cavity. Also in the dorsal body cavity, you are going to find the brain, but the brain is located in the cranial cavity of the dorsal body cavity. The main function of the spinal cord is really twofold. First of all, it provides a way for signals to get up to the brain and down from the brain. So it provides a conduction route to and from the brain. But it also serves as an integrator for many reflexes. So we have different types of reflexes, and our spinal reflexes are coordinated at the level of the spinal cord. So spinal reflex includes like your patellar reflex, which you've probably had checked at the doctors, and they take that hammer and hit your knee, right? Or if you're like my doctor and don't even bother with the hammer, and you just kind of do like a karate chop at the knee. The spinal cord can be divided into different segments that correspond to each pair of spinal nerves. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, so 62 altogether. And the segment of the spinal cord that's attached to a nerve is referred to as a spinal cord segment. It's not really a true segment with a true anatomical border, but it's just a way to kind of talk about the spinal cord. So I mentioned nerves, spinal nerves. Don't forget, a nerve is just a bundle of axons. The spinal cord has different regions. In this picture here, you can see a nice color-coded schematic of the regions of the spinal cord. So in green, we see the cervical spinal cord, and thoracic is shown in blue, The lumbar region of the spinal cord is shown in purple, and the sacral region of the spinal cord is shown in red. Now, if you look closely, you're going to notice that the sacral region of the spinal cord, which is the bottom, most inferior portion of the spinal cord, it ends at around the level of lumbar vertebra number 2, right? And so if you look below that, you see these little red squiggly lines. And those are just nerves. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the spinal cord actually ends well before the vertebral column does. And we still have those big foramina in our vertebrae below the level of L2. And what we find in there is not spinal cord. What we're going to find in there is spinal nerves. So these are going to be nerves coming off the lumbar and sacral region of the spinal cord. Now, the regions of the spinal cord are named according to the level of the vertebral column from which the spinal nerves emerge. Like, for example, if you look at the sacral region of the spinal cord, it's not located at the sacrum. It's located at where the thoracic vertebrae end and the lumbar vertebrae begin. But the sacral region of the spinal cord is called the sacral region because if you look at the nerves coming off the sacral region, right, look at this picture here, the nerves are exiting the vertebral column at the level of the sacrum. So as I mentioned, the spinal cord ends at about the level of the first or second lumbar vertebra. And at the end of the spinal cord kind of forms like a cone shape. It's called the medullary cone, also called the conus medullaris. But don't forget that even though the spinal cord ends at about the level of L2, nerves still continue down the spinal canal. And the group of nerves that continue down the spinal canal there, those are called, collectively referred to as the cauda equina. Equina means horse, and cauda means tail. And if you look at the picture over here, you can see why they named this the horse's tail, because the nerves here look like the hairs on a horse's tail. The spinal cord does have some membranes associated with it. So these are called meninges. Meninges are found on the outside of the brain and also on the outside of the spinal cord. And the meninges of the brain are actually continuous with the meninges of the spinal cord. And there are 3 layers to the meninges that protect the spinal cord. It's the dura mater, or mater if you prefer, arachnoid mater, and then pia mater. And these three layers help to basically just protect the spinal cord. They isolate it from the other tissues of the body, so it's a way to kind of keep things like pathogens out. Which is why meningitis can be a big problem. So you've probably heard of meningitis. Meningitis is inflammation of the meninges, and it's often due to some sort of infection. And this is a big problem because if the meninges become infected, you've basically lost your only protection that the spinal cord has against infectious agents. And so now the infectious agents, the pathogens, can actually have access to your central nervous system, which can be a very dangerous situation. Because your central nervous system doesn't have a lot of other defenses other than the meninges and things like the blood-brain barrier in order to combat pathogens. In this picture here, we can see the spinal meninges. Down at the bottom in brown here, we can see the outer layer, which is called the dura mater. Dura as in durable, meaning tough, and mater is mother, so this translates as tough mother. Just deep to that, we find the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is named for the fact that it has these little cobweb-like structures that we find associated with it. And then the deepest of the meninges, shown in pink here, is the pia mater. And again, their main function is just protection. To look at these meninges from a different perspective, right? This is looking at a cross-section through the vertebral column and spinal cord. In brown again, or brownish orange, I guess, we can see the dura mater, the most superficial of the meninges. And then in white, we see the arachnoid mater, and you can kind of see some of those web-like structures that I mentioned, from which the arachnoid mater gets its name. And then in pink, we see the pia mater. Also in this picture, we can see the spaces associated with the meninges. Out here, packed full of fat, is something called the epidural space. And the epidural space is of clinical significance because it is a site that's used for anesthetic injection. We can also see another space associated with meninges here. In blue, we see the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid. Another place in the spinal cord that contains cerebrospinal fluid is the central canal. So the cerebrospinal fluid of the subarachnoid space in the central canal does flow continuously with the cerebrospinal fluid of the brain. So the cerebrospinal fluid is actually made up in the ventricles of the brain at structures called choroid plexuses, which are blood vessels that are coated with a type of glial cell called an ependymal cell. So anyways, the subarachnoid space, it does contain cerebrospinal fluid, and it is of clinical significance because we use this as a site for the withdrawal of cerebrospinal fluid through a process called a lumbar puncture, also called a spinal tap. And we might do this in order to test the cerebrospinal fluid for things like pathogens, or we can do tests to check for cancer. And there's a few different circumstances for which they might want to test cerebrospinal fluid. In this picture here, we can actually see a lumbar puncture being performed, right? If you notice, they're inserting the needle between the spinous processes of lumbar vertebra 3 and lumbar vertebra 4. And when they do a lumbar puncture, they generally go in below the level of L2. And that's because, if you remember, I said the spinal cord ended at around L1, L2. And by doing the withdrawal below L3, what they're doing is they're making sure that if something goes wrong, let's say the needle goes deeper than it's supposed to, at least it's not puncturing the spinal cord and damaging the spinal cord. The worst it would do was possibly cause damage to some of those nerves. Now, don't get me wrong, that's bad too, but it's better than damaging the spinal cord. The next thing we're to look at is the cross-section of a spinal cord, and take a look at the anatomy there. Now, this is an actual slide showing you a spinal cord cross-section. Immediately you notice the yellow stuff that's actually found outside the spinal cord. Most of that's fat, and some of that fat is covering the axons of neurons. But looking at the spinal cord itself, you notice darker areas and lighter areas. We call this gray matter and white matter. Now, admittedly, the white matter is not perfectly white, the gray matter is not perfectly gray, but you get the idea. Kind of looks like one of those psychological tests, like an ink blot test almost. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a look at the gray matter in more detail. So gray matter in general, whether we find it in the spinal cord or the brain, is composed of neuron cell bodies. And this is different than white matter. White matter mostly contains myelinated axons. Gray matter is gray because the cell bodies can have a lot of contents inside of them, like a nucleus and other organelles, and that makes them denser, which makes the tissue darker. White matter mostly contains myelinated axons, so there's not a lot of density there, and the myelinated axons have fat on the outside of them, and fat can be white or yellowish in color, hence the white matter there. But let's take a look at the gray matter in more detail right now. When you look at a spinal cord cross-section, you notice that the gray matter is found centrally located as opposed to the superficial portions. That's where you find the white matter. And the function of the gray matter is to process information. It contains neuron cell bodies. So neuron cell bodies are capable of receiving information and then sending that information out. So the gray matter of the spinal cord receives incoming information from sensory receptors. So it's receiving incoming information about temperature and touch and those sorts of things. And then once it gets this information, it sends it usually up to the spinal cord, and we're going to use white matter for that. Now, another thing that the gray matter can do is that it can send outgoing commands to glands and muscles. Right? So when a signal comes down from the brain, it's going to come down through the white matter of the spinal cord. But to get out of the spinal cord, it has to make a stop at the gray matter. And there, the information will be sent to another neuron in the gray matter before it's actually sent out to a gland or a muscle. The gray matter of the spinal cord is symmetrical left and right. If you notice, just looking at either the right or the left half, we sort of have an area of gray matter towards the front, and that's called the anterior horn. And then we sometimes have a section of gray matter in the middle, that's called a lateral horn. And then there's a section of gray matter towards the back, and that's called the dorsal or posterior gray horn. And each of these has a different job. Let's first take a look at the posterior horn of the gray matter. The posterior horn of the gray matter is receiving incoming sensory information from the body. So if you look at the picture here, we can see that the posterior horn of the gray matter has an axon ending there. And this is the end of a sensory neuron axon. And this sensory neuron might be doing something like receiving touch information or temperature information in the skin. So that information is coming over here to the posterior horn. From there, it will be processed, and eventually it will be sent over to the white matter of the spinal cord and then sent up to the brain. The anterior horns function in sending outgoing motor messages. If you look in the picture here, and if you look at the anterior horn, you notice that we don't see the end of an axon. What we see is the cell body of a motor neuron. And the cell body of the motor neuron is going to send a signal out through this route towards a muscle or a gland. Right? What happens in order to send out this command is information will come down from the brain, and when it comes down from the brain, it will travel through white matter. But eventually that information will leave the white matter and come over to the anterior horn and send the message to this motor neuron cell body that we see here in the anterior horn, and then that motor neuron will send the signal on to the muscle or the gland. Now, the lateral horns are really only present in the thoracic spinal segments, and that's because the lateral horns are really only dealing with information from the viscera, from our guts, so like our intestines and our stomach and our spleen and our heart and our lungs. And all of that is located generally in the thoracic and abdominal regions. We don't have a whole lot of viscera in our cervical and sacral regions, so we don't see lateral horns there. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that. We're going to talk more about autonomic control, which is control of our viscera, in a different segment. And before I forget, I did want to mention the gray commissure. The gray commissure is a section of gray matter that connects the right and left halves of the gray matter. And right in the center of the gray commissure, we find the central canal, the spinal cord. And the function of the gray commissure is just to allow for some communication between the right and left portions of gray matter. So in this picture here, this is just kind of a different perspective. What we see is the different areas of the anterior and lateral and posterior horns of gray matter, and they've been kind of like separated out. And so you can see how towards the back we have sensory information being processed. So that would be our posterior horns. They handle the sensory information. But if you look towards the front of the gray matter, those anterior horns are handling motor information. And that's a key thing to remember for the spinal cord. And if you're having a hard time distinguishing posterior and anterior, here's a couple tricks. The dorsal root ganglion is only found on the dorsal side, and the anterior median fissure, a really big crack, is only found on the anterior side. So those are a couple of things to help you orient yourself in terms of anterior and posterior. Now this picture is just kind of showing you a big picture of how we could use the posterior horns of the gray matter to bring in a sensory signal. So in this picture here, someone is apparently pushing their finger down on a tack, right? And that's going to activate a pain sensory receptor. And that pain sensory receptor is basically a neuron that is going to send a signal to the spinal cord. And if you notice down here, the signal is being sent to the posterior horn of the gray matter. From there, eventually the information hops over to the white matter of the spinal cord and then is sent up to the brain, allowing you to feel that lovely pain of the tack on your finger. Now let's take a look at the white matter of the spinal cord. White matter is composed of mostly myelinated axons, so we generally don't find a lot of cell bodies in white matter. We are mostly finding axons there, myelinated axons. And the function of an axon is just to carry an action potential, to carry a signal. So structure is function. If the structure of the white matter is axons, then the function has to be to carry signals. And that's indeed what the white matter of the spinal cord does. It just relays signals up and down the spinal cord. When we look at the white matter of the spinal cord, we notice there's a front section, a back section, and a middle section, right? And these are called the anterior, lateral, and posterior white columns. They're also called the anterior, lateral, and posterior funiculi. And what's inside of them is just bundles of axons. Bundles of axons in the peripheral nervous system are called nerves. Bundles of axons in the central nervous system, like the spinal cord, are called tracts. So basically, these columns of white matter contain tracts. The function of these tracts is to carry nerve impulses down from the brain or up to the brain. So the ascending tracts, as you might imagine, are going to send signals up towards the brain, while the descending tracts are going to send signals down from the brain. And there could be a chain of 2 or sometimes 3 neurons that make up a tract. Now in this picture here, we've highlighted out some of the different tracts in the spinal cord. Now the spinal cord is very well mapped. We can predict with very high accuracy what would happen if you damaged an anterior horn at the level of L3 in your spinal cord. And so we have this very well mapped out. And we're not going to memorize all these different maps of the spinal cord, but what I just wanted to show you some of the information that we do know. So in this picture here, the blue areas are the ascending tracts, and the red areas are the descending tracts. And so these portions of the spinal cord will be sending information up and down to and from the brain. What's kind of interesting is that a lot of the tracts decussate. What that means is that they cross over from right to left. And decussation is very common in the central nervous system. And it's sort of an odd thing. We don't really know why it happens, but it is very common. Also, I failed to mention it earlier, but like the gray matter, the white matter has right-left symmetry, and so the white matter tracks are all paired right to left. And just kind of make sure you understand what's going on here with the white matter, I wanted to show you something else. So on this side of the screen, what we see is a cross-section of the spinal cord. Right? And we're going to cut it in half right down the middle, a mid-sagittal section. So that's what that blue line is signaling. And if we made a mid-sagittal section through the spinal cord, it might look something like this. So this is the white matter. This is the gray matter. And then the red tube is representing the central canal. So let's just take a look at the function of the spinal cord from a different perspective. So let's say we have a signal that's going to come in to the spinal cord from a sensory neuron. Okay, so the yellow arrow is representing my signal. When that signal comes in, it's going to come into a posterior horn in the gray matter. And then from there, the signal will be sent over to the white matter. And then once it gets to the white matter, that signal will be sent, up the white matter towards the brain. So it's going to be sent up through an ascending track of the white matter. Right? But now let's take a look at what if we want to send a motor command out, right? So if we want to send a motor command out to a muscle using the spinal cord, that signal will start up in the brain. Right? And to get down the spinal cord, it has to travel through the white matter, through a descending track of the white matter. Okay? And in order to leave the spinal cord, it has to go from a descending track of the white matter over to a anterior horn of gray matter where it will be processed, and then it can be sent out the spinal cord via spinal nerve. So hopefully that kind of helps a little bit.